Hi, everyone. I'd like to welcome you and thank you so much for coming to this session today. How's everybody's first day at MCN? Good? Yay? So today's session is called Hello and Welcome, Strategies for Social Inclusion. My name is Christina DiPaolo. I'm Director of Communications at For Culture. My colleague Lauren will be telling you a little bit about For Culture in a minute. But first, I want to let you know that the goal of this panel is to provide you with both strategy and tactics to implement to make your work more inclusive. We have four fabulous speakers. Today, and they will be sharing their expertise with you. You will hear from leaders who are creating cultural spaces that celebrate and respond to the needs of communities of color. And you will also hear from experts who are making changes to serve those people that their organizations have historically left out. One thing I wanted to do, since I work in the Pacific Northwest, is bring some of the great work that people are doing in the Pacific Northwest to this conference, as well as showcase leadership from New Orleans. So that's what you're going to get today, Seattle to New Orleans. I'm very excited to introduce our speakers. Carol Bebelle, Executive Director and founder of the Ashé Cultural Center. Leilani Lewis, Assistant Director of Diversity, Communications and Outreach at the University of Washington. Tasia Endo, Museum Educator for Interpretive Technology at the Seattle Art Museum. And my colleague, Lauren Summit, Digital Engagement Strategist at For Culture. I'm going to turn things over to Carol.
Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to New Orleans. And so I'll talk a little bit about like where we are now. Everybody wants to know that. So we're at about like 340,000 people here. We're at like 367, 370 something before the great federal flood in 2005, and we're rebuilding our community. There's a huge focus in our city right now on the issues that we're going to be talking about, like inclusion and equity. Right now, our government is doing its own equity audit, and we have a racial healing process that's at work in our community called the Welcome Table. And many of us are participating in national work that is really around being able to look at racial healing and racial and inclusion, equity, really being able to make that a viable and a very alive thing, in the city. At the same time, this has been a place that has attracted a lot of folks to come, and we are working with the whole issue of gentrification without displacement. And we're winning some places, losing some other places, and really trying to make it be a conversation. Ashé is in Central City, which is the hood here in New Orleans. And in a way, what we're attempting to do is to curate the neighborhood. Not just the place that we have, but the neighborhood, to be a place where we manage to do work that is both helpful and an investment in what it is that people need, want, and also a place where we provoke the consideration of what a better world would be like and what we need to do to make it. And I always find it hard to be able to get people to get what it is that we're doing without showing it to them. And so with that, we'll let you see our little film, and then I'll come back and unpack a few other things for you and be available after we hear these wonderful folks here. Big thing I'll say is Seattle and New Orleans are related in me because part of my family went to Seattle in the Great Migration. So Los Angeles and Seattle are where some of the Bebelles landed.
I'm sorry, I'm still having trouble with sound.
Uh-oh. So we'll go to the slides then if that's not working. Our mission is to use culture and art as our strategy for doing our work. And we focus particularly on the African American experience in our work. Not to the exclusion of all else, but it is the lens through which we look at everything else, right? And so we can move on along there. our kind of cultural framework, our paradigm, is one that looks at us as human beings being rooted in wherever it is that we're born, then bearing that until we run into something that requires us to consider bridging. And often that happens very early in our lives. You know, sometimes it's friends that are not family, sometimes it's church, sometimes it's school. Somebody who does things differently than you are, and then you start the process of sharing back and forth, like things that you're bringing on into your cultural identity. The other thing that happens is, so we have rooting, we have bearing, we have bridging, and then we have the final one, which is making. And so most of us in our life do some of all of that, but we mostly do the first three. You know, we root, bear, and bridge. Technology has essentially sparked a lot of culture making. And so we are able to see that when I say that. And so we're really mindful of this lens as we look at inclusion, and we look at the notion of how it is that you change, how it is that people kind of look at themselves and look at others. We're working really hard to have diversity and difference be something that people embrace rather than find themselves afraid of. And so our programming, and particularly the work that we do in visual art and in performance and the curation that we do there, is definitely focused on that. Next slide. So our program areas are really wide. We have, as you can see up there, we do our culture program, creative programming. We are doing education programs. So inside of this conversation about inclusion, we're really clear that kids start off really not knowing this stuff, and we learn it inside of our bearing and our rooting and our bearing. We have been contacted 2 or 3 times in the last 2 weeks by preschool parents whose kids go to integrated schools because they've had racial circumstances to occur with the young kids. Things like some of the white kids saying to black kids, "I can't play with you," and this kind of thing. So the parents are trying to figure out how to take care of that. And so we have an Institute of Cultural Education where we teach preschool teachers, Head Start teachers, kindergarten teachers. We help them to understand how it is that you help to, first of all, root kids really well in who they are so that they can be comfortable in the world. And we help teachers to understand how to be able to manage to be more inclusive in terms of how it is that they operate their classes. And so our programming is pretty thorough because there's a way in which culture pervades everything in the human experience. And how we feel about others also pervades everything in the human experience. And so I'm going to move now to looking at the kinds of exhibits that we've done, and in our effort to be able to help with that. And so the very first exhibit that we did was one called The Ties That Bind, Making Family in New Orleans Style. This was funded by the Casey Foundation. It was when we first got started. And it was really an opportunity to, for Casey, the issue of family making was very critical because that was their focus is on children and on strengthening families. For us, it was an opportunity to be able to celebrate this way in which we really operate like in 3 kind of areas here in family making in New Orleans. So you have one, obviously the biologic family, and it goes back to that paradigm I talked with you about being rooted and bearing and that kind of thing. The second one is the cultural family. Here we have a very active, populous cultural landscape in New Orleans. Literally, the culture bubbles up from the streets. And so that's the second one. And then the third one is that inside of culture is the spiritual traditions. And so there are lots of churches here, lots of spiritual traditions which are that are ancient in some instances, in some communities. And so it was a way of looking at how it is that people continue to collect together into family make in New Orleans. And it was an opportunity that we drew upon again in 2005 when the people were absent. We put the exhibit back up to have them present in Ashé because they were not present in the city. And so our space was being used a lot for meetings and trying to figure out what to do about the city in the post-disaster area. And so the walls were filled with photographs of people in these various families to be a present reminder of who this work was being done for. Last year, we completed almost a 9-month run of an exhibit called Ashé to Our Men that was done by Leslie Hammond King, and it was perfect for us in every way. It was about the enduring spirituality of African Americans. It was an opportunity to explore that topic with lots of programming that was everything from exploring Mary Magdalene to being able to have some of the self-proclaimed spiritual healers that are in the community to have sessions to talk about that, to talking about the necessity for healing in people healing in terms of racial discrimination, just the hardships of being poor in our society and that kind of thing. And often we use our programming in that way. The programming, in our instance, we really operate from that art for life posture. We're not an art for art's sake place. What we try to do is to operate in the way that art was given to us, which was out of the lived experience. And we try to use it in that way to be able to inform, to be able to provoke, and to be able to really create the opportunities to be able to allow people to embrace things that they are somewhat uncomfortable with. And so we are crossing themes and people all the time, whether it works out to be a matter of like celebrating queerness, whether it's about being able to explore connections between religious and spiritual traditions. We have a lot of work that is very specific to African American women and to African American men. We do a lot of work in both instances, and we are essentially trying to improve people's capacity to understand what's going on so that they're in a position to be able to make decisions about wanting to change. Wanting to embrace a different way of relating to people, themes, ways of life, and most of all, the commitment that's necessary to essentially enliven our democracy a bit more. And so we are constantly working on the whole notion of the possibility. In fact, we've said at times that maybe that's our revolutionary act, is to believe that there is an ability to have a better world than we have now here in America, and to really stand there, if alone, and hold that space until others start believing along with us. And so we are hoping that the national political theater has been working in that direction, to have people to really understand that part of what we are being called to do is to be active in the part of being we the people, and having the we to be every kind of person that you can. And I tell people often, when you close your eyes, you say the word we, and if all you see are people who look like you, then you got some work to do. And too many of us are in that situation, that when we say we, that we are really talking about people who are near and dear to us, but we're not seeing, feeling, or considering others who are part of our we. And so we are constantly in the process of trying to do programs and program in a way where we're able to help people to embrace the potential of weaving a wider and a better we. And so I'll hold for a moment and pass it on.
Oh. Thank you.
Thank you.
Are you caught up in the wire?
Did I do it here on time? Okay. I lost the film, so I was lost a little bit.
Greetings. Hi, everyone. My name is Leilani Lewis. Thank you, Carol. That was really good and really connected to what I'm going to talk about, which again really centers on making meaning within the institutions that we work for, and connecting people so that they can enjoy and take part in that meaning making that we're doing. So I'm sorry, I can't sit down and present. I'm a weirdo. Can't do it. I gotta stand up. I'm really excited to be here in New Orleans and share this with you, but I wanted to, because New Orleans is such a beautiful city, but Seattle is a very different city, a very different place. Anybody from Seattle know about Seattle? Feel, okay, all right. I see ya. So in my work at the Northwest African American Museum, where I was for 8 years before I started at the University of Washington, we had an interesting sort of way to talk about inclusion and to invite people to the institution. So I'll cover that in just a moment. But first I wanted to sort of set the stage here. This is sort of the statistics in Seattle. About 7 million people in the state, 80 identify as white, and I'm calling that out, and I'll tell you why. In our county, about 61%, about 2 million people, and then, is that right? No, that's wrong. Sorry, those are inverted. Anyway, sorry about that. It's about 600 to 700,000 people in the city of Seattle. It is a very It's a very white city, white identified city in many places. It is not completely that way, and I wanted to talk about how we reach out to the people who don't identify that way and how we wanted to create space and make meaning for them in this city where a lot of things are oriented toward one specific group. Before I get into that, though, I wanted to set the stage. I think that a lot of people have different philosophies and different approaches to reaching out to communities of color, and I wanted to make sure that I set this stage because I hear approaches that are really terrible most of the time, and some are really good. But what I really wanted to emphasize here is that you must ask yourself some questions before you approach this work, so that you're not causing harm or going into communities in a way that is invasive or sort of doesn't have a good feel for either party, either the institution or the community that you're walking into. So I've set a few questions here, asking your audiences what they want, asking the people you want to reach out to. Do they have a history with the institution that you work for? Are you reaching out only when you have an exhibit or something that speaks to them, or are they part of your year-round work? And do you have members of your staff? Are they part of your community? Are they in your work? Are they inside? Are they on the inside and not the outside? So just some questions to consider as I move forward with the presentation. I can go to the next slide. So I worked back to the Northwest African American Museum. I worked there for 8 years. I was 8 years old. I came in right when it was starting, fresh off my degree. I was so excited to be a part of this new museum. It just got a brick and mortar, and tiny young museum, 8 full-time staff, 12 staff total, 13,000 visitors per year over the roughly averaged over the last 6 or 7 years. So it's a young new museum. When I got there, it has a 30-year history in that community, in the central area of Seattle, which is a historically black, and then before that Jewish, and before that Japanese neighborhood. So a layered history of the neighborhood that the museum is situated in. 30 years after the idea of the museum came to be, to the point where it was inside of a building. So that's something that I had to learn and be really cognizant of when I was thinking about programs. Also, the longest occupation was held at this site in the Coleman building, Coleman Elementary School building. It's a 100-year-old building, and squatters, not squatters, actually it was community members who wanted to preserve that space, to hold space for the African American community. They were there for 8 years, no running water, no boarded up walls, boarded up windows, and they wanted to hold that space. So the museum and its location has a lot of meaning in that community, and that's very important to consider, and it was something that we needed to consider moving forward with programming. So within the museum, and as it was kind of coming together, we went to communities, to people in the community, and basically asked them if they would like to contribute their goods, their ephemera, their objects, and build sort of a history timeline and a history exhibit in the main gallery. It's a beautiful, beautiful exhibit, and it talks about history of African Americans in the Northwest for going back to before the turn of the century when the first African American settlers came up. And then there's a larger gallery, the Northwest Gallery, where they're changing out exhibits every 6 to 9 months or so. Art, some history. On both of these slides, we have the Orchidarium with Deborah Moore. She's a local glass artist, one of the only African-American glass artists in the region. And we have Zenobia Bailey, who is now in New York, lives in Brooklyn, but she's also a Northwest native, so we brought her work back in. And there have been many exhibits since then. So how do we, you might be thinking why we would need to connect with the community. We already had this sort of community practice in our collections and other ways to sort of connect with community, but the thing was we didn't have the capacity to program, and we weren't thinking about, we were thinking about programming from the examples that we had around us, the artist talk, the kind of more traditional museum programs, and they weren't necessarily bringing in the people that we thought we wanted to bring in, which was some of the new people that were coming to the city, and some of the young African American and people of color who were interested in art and activism and the intersections therein. We started to think a little bit differently, and we didn't have a theory of change. It wasn't like a year-long plan. It wasn't like that. It was just sort of, we had this exhibition coming called Afros, based on a table book by this really great guy, and we had a wonderful natural hair salon that's down the street, who specialized in doing natural hair and celebrating natural beauty, and they had a large following and connection. And we also wanted to bring a little bit of Brooklyn to Seattle, kind of piggybacking off the vibe, the cool factor, and created this really amazing celebration called Afropunk Bash. So we partnered with Afropunk, we partnered with this hair salon, and had this wonderful sort of party slash runway show slash hair show at the museum, bringing people to the exhibition, but also introducing a whole new group of people, locals, who might not have come to the museum because of this sort of long, tumultuous history, and there was some ill feelings there, and we brought them into the museum and tried to make some connections. And this is a first touch type of program. Going forward, I think that our concern was that we also weren't being very responsive to the needs of the community during times of tragedy. Carol asked a great question last night over dinner, is how do we define a museum? And like, what is that space? What is that space? And at NAMM, we had that conversation quite a bit, and we talked about the museum sometimes being a healing space. Sometimes it transforms. It's a space for celebration. It's a space for contemplation. And in this case, after the shootings of Michael Brown and many others since then, we did want to make it a healing space and a place to talk about the issues. So this is one of our first social justice focused programs that happened about, say, 3 or 4 years ago now. And we partnered with an organization called Pachakacha Seattle. Anybody know about Pachakacha? Okay, it's like a fast, like a rapid presentation format. People give 6 minutes presentations. They have like 20 slides, 20 seconds per slide. And we opened it up. We had mostly people of color, mostly African Americans in the community, luminaries, and allies give presentations. And it was really, I guess, one of the great writers in our city, Charles Mudede, called it, what did he call it? He called it church. It was like church. So the museum at that point became a healing space, a church, a place to talk about these issues. They were relevant. It was responsive. We came up with this program and got the partnership together in 10 days after the murder of Mike Brown. So it's a lot of work, but it was worth it, and it put the museum in a different space in people's minds all over the city. Oh, I think I did. Did I do Afropunk Bash? There we go, Complex Exchange. So the next program I'm going to talk about, the most recent and the one that I kind of carried on right before I left the museum was complex exchange. Another way we wanted to bring people in or open the door to the museum was to draw connections with and cross audiences with the larger museum. I was about, I'd say, now over a year and a half ago, I reached out to the Seattle Art Museum because I knew Kehinde Wiley was coming to, Kehinde Wiley, everybody's familiar with the work of Kehinde Wiley, superstar, was coming to the Seattle Art Museum, which is our big museum in Seattle, huge. It is much larger than NAMM, and we had an exhibition coming up at the same time called the Kelly Collection African American Artworks on Paper. And that featured masters Jacob Lawrence and many others and their work at NAMM, so predecessors to Wiley in many ways. So we came up with a 4-part series that featured the voices of artists, musicians, writers, performers, and several others in the city, and in dialogue about their practice. And we asked them to come up with questions about their work and how, in relation to Wiley and the Kelly Collection, the works of the Wiley and Kelly Collection. Most of the participants were African American. Most of the presentations were sold out to mixed audiences all across the city. And I think that what's most important about this exchange is that we had a real strong equity lens going into this partnership. SAM being very big, having a lot more resources, having a lot of pull, and then NAMM and the staff within having a lot of relationships now built on programs that had brought the museum into a space of great relevance that they could draw on to make those connections. So we did this program. It was great. We had a lot of lessons learned from it, and I'll be presenting at Museum Next here pretty soon, I think in a couple weeks, on this very program with the Seattle Art Museum. So going back to, I think, did I have something? Yep. For connecting with communities of color, you need to build trust. Going back to the questions I had on the first slide, practice equity. You need to think about what people need and deliver on those needs. Look internally. Does your staff, does your structure, does the people that are in your circle reflect the people you're trying to serve? And build the community, invite people in, build the doors that have people come through the doors.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Hi, everybody. I'm Tasia Endo. I'm the museum educator for interpretive technology at the Seattle Art Museum. Out of curiosity, just because I'm curious, who's an educator in this group? Okay, great. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about working with our audiences and how we try to do that inclusively by leveraging our existing institutional strategies using technology. So first, let me tell you a little bit about the Seattle Art Museum. We're a museum of 3 sites, and our mission is to connect art to life. Here's our vision, and you can read that, but I just want to highlight this one piece where we seek to engage audiences using innovative uses of technology, probably speaking to the fact that we have huge technology companies in our city like Microsoft and Amazon. But next slide, please. Centering our work around art, we're working with a global art collection, and that affords us engagement with diverse perspectives and broad audiences. And so the images here are just a brief glimpse into our different collection areas. Our Native American galleries are very popular with school tours. Our Asian Art Museum gets really lively for our Diwali-themed Free First Saturday program. And here's a recent reinstallation of our African galleries, and even our modern and contemporary galleries show international and artists of color. Next slide. So, does this look familiar? We connect art to life, and technology is so everywhere in our lives today. I'm sure 100% of you have at least one, if not 2, mobile devices on hand. And we really see this in our visitor experience. And so we've embraced that. Beyond updating our photo policy and encouraging photos in all of our exhibitions, we try to use technology in other ways to inclusively engage our audiences. Next slide, please. And we've done that through exhibition-based community partnerships. This is an example from the Kehinde Wiley exhibition that Leilani mentioned, where we did this really well, and it's a model we're using moving forward, where Sam hosted this online community calendar that was populated through programs that were already happening in other organizations across the city that had thematic connections to our exhibition, but also could be a place for people to find out about these great partnership programs that Sam did create specifically for this exhibition with NAM, like the Complex Exchange Series. Next slide, please. Great. So in addition to our large-scale special exhibitions, we also do really large-scale public programs too, and we can use technology to make those more inclusive as well, and we do that through program outreach primarily. We have Sam Remix. It's our after-hours event that draws up to like 3,000 people to the museum, and we do this 3 times a year. And for that, we rely on this co-host model where we partner with other organizations to cross-promote, and we do that very digitally with discount codes that we send to email lists or social media posts. And sometimes we've also opened up our Twitter account for guest tweeters, which really opens up the institutional voice at the museum of how people engage with the event. And here's an example of a recent co-host sharing about Sam Remix this summer. It's the French American Chamber of Commerce. Next slide, thanks. But in terms of the gallery experience and the work that I'm more close to, interpretation using technology in its content tries to be very accessible by featuring multiple voices. We believe that that provides multiple access points to ideas, and it provides wider representation of voices of authority. And we've seen that in our audio guide projects, where we not only have the curator speaking on them, but also past projects have included voices of artists, fashion designers and icons, a Catholic priest, Native storytellers, and teens. And so while these larger scale projects are generally for our special exhibitions with large resources to do those, we also use the same approach for our smaller scale projects around our permanent collection. And an example of that is our My Favorite Things cell phone tour and videos. We realized there are so many interesting people that always come through the museum, and we wanted to capitalize on that and capture their thoughts around our collection. And we've turned that into cell phone tour stops in the galleries and YouTube videos online. So in addition to the content aiming to be accessible, we try to do that in how we deliver that content, and we do that by always providing it for free on your own device. So if there's any fees involved, it would be to offset the cost of like an audio guide one, but the content should be available for free in your own way. And this has really worked for us, and it hasn't limited us in experimentation. And an example of that is also for Kehinde Wiley, we tried out augmented reality for the first time. Using the free Layar app, we were able to make connections with the artist's many source materials using pop-up content on top of the paintings in that app. And when device access might be an issue, like maybe people don't necessarily have smartphones or want to do that, we also make efforts to provide that same content on kiosks in the galleries. So we provided all of that content that was in that app experience on tablets in the galleries. We also believe this strategy aligns with our institutional priorities around accessibility, particularly with the low-no vision audience. people are comfortable with their own devices, and also it's pretty low cost to create verbal descriptions. It's pretty much my staff time, but to put that content on the cell phone to our platform so that there's this low, no vision complement to our general interpretive offerings. So while art like the Kehinde Wiley exhibition certainly engages broad audiences, engagement strategies using technology make SAM more inclusive of a place. We know people are going to be using their devices like this in the galleries, and so by meeting people where they are, we can increasingly connect art in more meaningful ways to their lives. Thanks.
Hi, my name's Lauren, and as Christina promised, I'm going to explain what For Culture is, since our name is a little bit unclear. We are a public funding agency. We use dollars from Washington's hotel tax to invest into the King County cultural community. And we do that through 4 main avenues: arts, heritage, public art, and historic preservation. And that investment happens through a full year of competitive grant programs. We fund a huge range of organizations, individuals. There are tons of museums, theaters, symphonies, individual artists, artist collectives, you name it, we've probably funded it at some time or another. And we also produce our own participatory program where we try to get King County engaged in its own culture identity and highlight some of the voices of our community. And I include this photo of a bunch of posters on a wall outside of Seattle's Pike Place Market because I think it's a really good sort of visual representation of what we do and how a lot of people first encounter us. If we were to zoom in on all of these posters one by one, you'd probably see our logo at the bottom of at least half of them. And these posters were put up by people from all over King County. So we're really out there funding just a huge range of stuff. So what does social inclusion look like for us as a funder and not a museum? So regionally, we're certainly a financial source, but we're also a source of knowledge. We can fund more equitably, and we can make our processes permanently more accessible to those who have been sort of excluded historically. And we can also share what we learn through that experience of auditing our processes. So 2015 and 2016 have seen a really concentrated effort agency-wide to offer grants and programs to people who have been historically excluded, but also to model inclusion for our community, and also to really embed what that inclusion into every aspect of what we do. So what I do is digital engagement, digital communications. So I'm going to give you a couple examples of how I've been working with my communications fellow comrades to embed inclusion into what we do. And certainly there's a lot of tactics we're using, and there's hopefully going to be a lot more in the coming years, but I'm going to give you 2 examples. One's really broad and one's really specific. So broadly, we're rebuilding our brand voice from the ground up. The brand voice is really the front line of how people engage with us digitally, and I think a lot of times when we talk about brand voices, we talk about creating positive sentiment towards the institution, but we're trying to move beyond that and to really assess how we talk about ourselves through this lens of social inclusion. We're asking ourselves how we can use language to center those who haven't been centered for the whole of our history. So this is one small example from a huge suite of materials that we've been working on this year. We're redesigning our website, so I've spent the last year just rewriting every word of that website. And this is a before and after of our About Us statement. You can see before is pretty dense and inaccessible. I don't know if you guys can read all this text. Can you read this from back there, sort of?
It's
Okay.
really hard to read.
Gotcha, okay.
You want to read out loud?
Yeah, so I'll just read the first couple sentences of the before. It says, "For Culture, the Cultural Services Agency for King County, Washington, is committed to making our region stronger by supporting citizens and groups who preserve our shared heritage and create arts and cultural opportunities for residents and visitors." Our after statement is much, much shorter. It's, as the cultural funding agency for King County, For Culture works to make our region vibrant. Look for all the ways we are at work in your community. So there's a few sort of key differences here. It's not perfect. We're still continuing to tweak it because we're sort of hard to explain. But the after statement really puts what people need from us right up front. They need our funding. So we don't want to use funding jargon that you hear a lot, that you only know if you already know it, if you're in the community already. It also uses first-person language, we, you, our, us. And it includes an invitation to action that's very low barrier. So, it starts to establish a relationship between us and the communities that we want to engage with. So this is my sort of more specific example of ways we're working on inclusion in digital spaces. So one of those programs that I mentioned earlier is called Poetry on Buses. We really love it. We piloted it in 2014, and this year was the sort of second iteration of it. We invite King County residents of all ages, all backgrounds, all skill levels in writing to submit original poetry. Peer panels then select from those submissions to put those poetry on our regional transit. And we really focus on engaging and encouraging submissions from non-English speaking communities. And we do that by extensively translating all of our outreach materials and also through workshops. And those are really just magical, wonderful experiences because they just put us right in touch with these communities. We hire poets and liaisons from those communities to help set up those workshops and to be able to speak directly to the non-English speaking communities. So some of those communities were Spanish, Vietnamese, Chinese, Somali, Amharic, Tlingit, and Russian. And Tlingit, I don't know if it's kind of a Pacific Northwest thing that we know really well, but it's a sort of Alaskan Native American community that we have a lot of in Seattle. So we created Facebook events for each of those workshops, and those became a really, really great space to both listen and speak inclusively to those communities and sort of start to establish relationships with them. And I'm going to give you examples of things that we learned through this process, and we sort of completed it over the summer. So a lot of it is still very fresh, and we're still sort of assessing how that worked. So one thing we learned is that what happens in the digital space that you use has to be really accurate to what's going to happen in the analog space. You can't use bait and switches if you're going to put photos. I think there was a session in here earlier that was really great that talked about not staging photos for diversity for your institutions, and this is kind of what this is saying. Here's a photo of Claudia Castro Luna, who's the Seattle civic poet, and she's a really well-known, beloved figure in the Spanish-speaking communities, and she was actually at the workshop facilitating people writing poetry for the first time. So we have her photo there. She wasn't just put up as sort of like a signpost. We have posts in the different languages. We did a lot of translating. We encouraged poets to post in their languages on the Facebook walls. And the events themselves were bilingual, so it wasn't like, posting in the language to get people drawn in and then have them show up at a workshop that they couldn't speak their own language in. So another lesson we learned was to respect honest negative reactions and complicated dialogue. And certainly we all know that a huge group of water protectors are in North Dakota to protect their land and their water resources right now. And that was all happening over the summer as well. And we had a Tlingit poet who went there to support his community, and there was a lot of sort of complicated discussion that came up out of that in the Facebook group or Facebook event page for that workshop that we were having. So we, sometimes when you see people angrily posting or posting with a lot of emotion, the impulse as a social media manager is to just shut it down, block, delete. But we checked in with the poet, we checked in with our community liaison, We watched the discussion really closely to make sure that no one was attacking each other, no one was being violent or threatening, and it was a very interesting discussion. We learned a lot about that community that we were sort of trying to build a relationship with through this program. So one lesson that was probably the hardest for me to learn, as Christina knows, your organizational social media policy probably rightly has pretty strict rules about posting and ownership of accounts. I know mine definitely does, and this is a space to really actually relax some of those posting rules about who can invite, who can engage, who can post on the wall. We encouraged all of our community liaisons and poets to invite whoever they wanted to share the event, to post about things that were relevant to them. And the value of that for us was that the members of the community who said that they were going to come to the event and who did eventually end up coming to the event felt like they had a really direct line of connection with someone who understood them, who was also related to For Culture. So it wasn't, it kind of gets back to what Catherine Bracey was speaking about this morning, where it wasn't like a top-down information sort of drop. It was open lines of communication more laterally and across all these different channels. So we hope that built a lot of trust between us and these communities that we're just starting to develop relationships with. So, great. Thank you.
Before I open it up to questions, I just really want to thank these fabulous speakers. I am so proud to have Carol here, and I'm so proud of the work that you guys are doing in my home in the Pacific Northwest. Thank you so much. And I would like to open for questions. Does anyone have a question for our speakers?
Hi.
Could you use the microphone?
Sure.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks to everyone. It was great. And of course, I remember the last thing that was said. So that's what, I like the idea of, that we have to reflect in our digital what's happening in real life, in the analog and that kind of thing, not kind of like, oh, pretty pictures, that kind of thing. But also, I love, and I could love to hear this from all of you, it's also chicken and egg kind of thing, that if you always have pictures of the people that come to programs and it's all white and everything, and you're trying to say, oh, we want people to feel included as well. So then if the pictures are, so I think chicken and egg, what's authentic, when we're using digital representations, how do we negotiate that? And not just you brought it up, but I'd love to hear the opinion across the board, or maybe that's just, I think it's nuanced and it's on a lot of different levels, but particularly I know that when we pick out pictures for websites, it's committee discussion and everything else. So I'd love to hear from all of you on that.
Anybody want to take it?
Because we're working a lot people to people, we really like encouraging people to be able to use their moment of being excited or wanting to underscore something, and so we really kind of let them go in that regard, and we don't try to hold so tightly to it because we're also trying to expand the network. And so everybody that comes, that gets excited and decides to say something. And for the most part, people are saying, I'm here and I'm having a great time. Sometimes they'll post video as well, some piece of video as well. And so we really try hard not to interfere with that because it's such an authentic kind of response. And often it translates. Sometimes they're on the side kind of making their comments while the stuff is going on and all. So, so that's kind of the way we are handling it now.
I have an answer for that, and I don't know if it's the best answer. That I deal with this now more at the University of Washington, but if the organization and institution is doing the work to invite people in, to make sure to open that space up, to invite people to the table, to create programming, to create those channels of engagement, you're going to have photos of people from all different spaces. If your institution is not doing that work or not centering that work, you're going to find that you're not going to have a lot to choose from. So I think that as communicators, we're following, this is, the programming, and we're communicating about what's happening. But if it's not happening, we find ourselves without much to communicate in that way. And you don't need to have photos to attract people to the thing. You can do that with language, you can do that with partnership. There's a lot of other ways to do that. But that's something to consider. Anyway.
Yeah, also on that note, I mean, it was challenging with this Poetry on Buses program because, like I said, there's Punjabi, Vietnamese, Amharic. I mean, those communities all look very different. They dress very differently. So it wasn't just a matter of putting photos of, vaguely diverse crowds up there. It was, we had to have a photo of Punjabi community members writing poems. So you can't just really find that on Photoshop or a stock photo or something like that. So
don't use stock photos.
Yeah, don't use stock photos. No. Yeah. So we actually had a visual brand for the program that, like Leilani said, used all those different languages in translation to say, like, write a poem or share your work, that we used until we had a couple of those workshops and made sure to get great photos, and then we started working those in. So there's lots of ways to be visually inclusive without just photos, I think.
One of the things I didn't mention is that though we don't have a big budget for communications, that we've made the commitment to have, we have some of our community professional photographers that are always present doing video, and so that we can be certain that we are capturing great moments that can manage to be more expressive, both of what we're doing as well as who's coming to see it. And so we kind of work between what it is that people capture, as well as being able to be certain that we are pursuing and looking for those moments as well.
Sorry, I'm just going to come in for the microphone. I also wanted to make, oops, I knew I'd do something like that. I also want to make a couple comments because I was at the Afropunk event, and it was one of the most fun events I've ever been to in Seattle in the whole 25 years that I've lived there. And it really was, I felt so welcome, and I had so much fun. And when I left, there were staff saying thank you. At every touch point of the event, I felt welcome and I felt engaged. And I think it really clicked in what you were saying, because you created that experience. And so anything about that experience, any media created, was just a reflection of the personal experiences that people had at the event. And then I also wanted to talk about photography. Working for a funding agency, our funding agency is very proud of taking public dollars that come from taxpayers' dollars and really being a responsible bursar of that, and making sure that as much of that money, all of that money, goes out into the community for culture and heritage. So my organization is not used to spending money on communications, photography, video, those kind of things. So I've really worked strategically, and because I have a long nonprofit history of working with no budget, I'm sure many of you can relate to that, I really figured out a way to be strategic about photography. So we actually did something to create a roster of designers and artists and photographers who could help us along the way. And then I work from that roster and hire artists to support us. So it works with our culture, because our culture as a funder is to support artists. So I now have this talent roster that I work from, and Tim Aguero, who does he does our Poetry on Buses photography, he's a part of that roster. So we were able to figure out a way to put dollars in communications that really worked with our culture as an organization. Any other questions? Great.
Okay, well, I'm right here. So this kind of spans across a couple, or if anyone can speak to this, although it was prompted by the Seattle when you were talking about having guest tweeters for certain events. And I wanted to just expand on that and tie it in a little bit with what you talked about with Facebook, but this could apply for anything as you're thinking about an avenue for inclusivity as being a little bit more relaxed in the use of social media and the institutional voice, and frankly being more human and tying into this whole conference. But kind of, do you have other experiences or specific things in which you've used that and it went wrong or it went badly because either then there was confusion about who was doing it, or I'm just curious if you could speak more about that concept or those specific events. Or if that was too
I
vague.
can't speak so much about social media because I don't particularly work on that, but an example of where institutionally we weren't immediately comfortable with opening up institutional voice was when we collaborated with our teen arts group and allowed them to create cell phone tour stops in our permanent collection. It may seem, you might expect that it might not be of the rigor that you would expect in a general tour, but we made sure to make it known that they did a lot of research and that it is up to the same quality as everything else. It just happens to be a teen voice and what is interesting to them. So, sorry, I really can't speak to the social media aspect, but that was one potentially rough example that we've had.
Yeah, I can.
Okay.
Yeah, kind of, I mean, speaking of teens on social media, we have another program that we produce called Creative Justice, where we work with court-involved youth in King County to get them involved in art classes and training as a way to sort of, as a not replacement for, but they have lessened sentences when they go through this program. So we recently, for the social media for that program, took on an intern who was a youth who had gone through the program previously. And I think in that situation, giving that youth responsibility, she just rose to the occasion immediately with like no question. Like when you have, this is our social media policy, this is why we do the things we do, and why we have to create safe spaces online for people. Like she just got it instantly and is doing great work with it. So I think explaining, being transparent about why you have the systems in place that you have, and trusting people with that information goes a long way. I mean, certainly all of the community liaisons that I had posting on these Facebook events got copies of our social media policy, and I was available to answer questions about that, and they were just very, very, they took it very seriously, and they really understood that they were ambassadors for both their communities and for us, and that it was, a relationship building activity.
And I wanted to say one thing about that. When we had those passionate posts about the Urban Native Workshop, Lauren said there was this impulse, like, oh, we should do something. And I really loved the process there, that there were about 4 people. There was myself, Heidi Jackson, who runs Poetry on Buses workshop program, where we said, no, this is okay. Let's talk to Tracy, who's the liaison, and find out what's going on. And Lauren said, I feel really uncomfortable doing anything because I don't know this community, I don't know circumstances. And so we had that discussion and that sensitivity right off. And we also were patient. We stepped back. I think the thing is not to rush, to really just be okay. And the thing with social media, and I've done in the past, it's like when controversial things come up on social media about your organization, it happens so quickly, and you feel this, you feel pressure to respond immediately. Because it's happening so quickly, and then people are on you so quickly. And the first thing in that circumstance is you need to respond, but you need to take your time to really be able to respond responsibly. And you're representing your organization, so you want to respond in the in the true voice of your organization, and you wanted to be thoughtful. So I felt it was great because that's what we did right away. It was like, you know, it was our process, and so I just wanted to, you know, I just wanted to go into that a little bit more.
I'd like to weigh in on this. A couple of things. One is we had an occasion that wasn't really about any of our programming. It was about something that was happening on our street. And so sometimes when people have negative things to say, sometimes you need to just take it in and leave it alone, because what happens is that if you participate, then what you do is you kind of grow something that doesn't need to be grown. What you need to know is to hear that. Sometimes you can get with the person if you know them. If not, you can at least hear what they're talking about. And this was about the streetscape. You know, we've been 9 years, we've been trying to get a streetscape. The streetscape is now happening. And we've got folks that are all upset about what they're doing, how they're doing it, et cetera, et cetera. And so the concrete's down. There's nothing we're going to be able to do about that. So, you know, so that's just one kind of an additional consideration. Toward the notion of the things that happen in social media, one of the things is that someone talked about complicated conversations. I call them awkward ones. You've got programming that provokes a bit of awkwardness, right? And so one of the things I think is really important inside of the social inclusion kind of agenda is to really have a process for being able to handle those things when they're happening. Because sometimes you need the balance between being able to have it go out and come back to you and become programming, and having the opportunity to be able to essentially widen people's ability to be able to handle discomfort as a part of life. And we've had more than a few occasions where we've had irate people in the room about something that was on the stage. And so, you know, the thing to do is to be able to handle it. We've used listening, we used story circles, we used obviously Q&As and that kind of thing. But some of the work to make the inclusion like deeper is really about having people be able to face each other inside of the things that they are upset and passionate and all about. And so we really work hard to try to balance that between being able to give people the opportunity to be able to, you know, be thoughtful about what they saw and to be able to respond to it, which is sometimes something that needs time, and also being able to catch what it is that essentially bubbles up inside of their being there, seeing an exhibit. And so we plan for it a lot with our exhibits. We plan for interaction of some kind particularly inside of things that have a provocative nature to them.
Great. Well, it's after 5, so I want to, so our panel is done, but I want to thank you so much for attending, and I want to thank you so much for presenting. Thank you so much.